I often share this little video clip from the end of this video series that I produced by a Dr. John Sanford. He's probably one of the world's top geneticists from Cornell University, and he ended his little teaching that I've used by saying the purpose of all this evidence for creation isn't even to necessarily just kind of convince people this is the truth, because most people, they already know what they believe and they're not looking for something else. It's to remove barriers to faith. That's the best we can do, is to help remove what is the barrier keeping people from coming to faith. And this whole issue of evolution is a big one. Now, I've almost already just started to jump into things. My main goal tonight is to leave you with some resources. Very, very different resources, produced in different ways with different purposes. Some of them you need to invest in to make a difference. Most of them don't cost anything. I want to talk about the books I've produced first. I have authored and co-authored 8 books on the evidence for creation. By far, hands down, the most popular, the most useful are a series of creation devotionals. Now, those of you who have heard me, I already talked, they say, oh, I've got that one, I've got that one, I've got that one, and you know they're useful. But a week doesn't go by where I don't get a letter or an email from somebody who says, this has just been a phenomenal way to reach the world around me and my family. I had someone who had just been in the hospital for tests. They took one of these books, and by the way, every day of the year there's a different topic on creation. One day may be something about a bat that's found in biology. The next day may be something about microbiology. Another day may be about cosmology or physics or astronomy or fossils or dinosaurs. Short, interesting stuff with a Bible verse at the end. Because who doesn't find some degree of fascination by the world around us? And that's what tonight's talk's going to be about. And I'll get to that in just a second. But if you don't have any of these phenomenal witnessing tools, and I have produced now 600,000 books. The majority have been given away. The majority of those have been given away into public schools overseas. I've been on 8 2 to 3 week long missions trips. Sometimes I take as many as 18 people. Sometimes it's just a team of teacher of 4 of us, 2 couples. And we have permission to get into the public high schools of multiple nations. The Department of Education in Fiji gave us permission to do science assemblies in their school, in every high school in the nation. And over a 3-year period, we spoke in 162 out of 168 high schools in the entire nation. So the whole nation, every single student got one of these devotionals, which ties what they're learning in school directly back to what the Bible has to say in a very interesting, credible way. Really, really neat way to do evangelism. Also been to the Philippines, to Vanuatu, just a little update. Shut down for 2 years because of COVID. Every school nation worldwide, in one way or another, shut down. In the Philippines, they haven't had public schools open for 2 years. Think of what that's doing to an entire generation. But I get a call from a missionary just about 3 months ago, and we've already set up, the next trip will be to Peru in March, and we'll be down there for almost 3 weeks, and we'll give away about 10,000 books and do science assemblies in the public schools in Peru. And they're in Spanish, and we'll do it through a translator. So the work is going to continue. So organizations like this are what fund that kind of outreach, and it's really encouraging to see God using this reality and truth of what He has to say in His Word about creation to impact lives. So these are really neat tools. Now, I spent about 2 years, from about before the start of COVID until 2 weeks ago, producing the 4th one of these devotionals. I'm going to pass it around because honestly, I'm taking pre-orders. We're ordering 10,000 of them at one time to keep the cost low. So it's about a $50,000 investment. And I'm going to pass it around. This is the manuscript. It will look beautiful, full-color hardcover book, just like these devotionals. And people typically, the vast majority of the books we sell are 10 or 20 at a time, because a case is 20. Because people love them so much, they give them out to everybody they know. And so I would just, while I'm talking, flip through the book, read the one that's on the page on your birthday, and then pass it on to the next person. If you'd like to pre-order, there's a form here. If you're not on my newsletter list, it comes out 4 times a year, no cost. Give me your address. So I'm going to pass these around. There's one that can, in no hurry, because I'm going to be talking for the next hour. And I'm going to pass one around on the other side. And as I said, there's a sign up for the newsletter. There's an order form to pre-order these books. And there's a copy of what this new book looks like. And this is my favorite one I've ever written. There's more in there about why the world is so blind. There's more in there about the history of what's happened as we've moved along. And there's all sorts of these examples you'll see as I go along about this magnificence of the things God has made. Just 2 other quickies. And again, I'm here to just talk, kind of equip, okay? Just think of me as somebody who's been at this for 30 years and he's trying to help equip. And by doing so, motivate. Folks who are willing to come out on a cold night to listen on this subject are the ones who are going to make a difference when it comes to this subject, and that's you guys. I spent the 3 years before COVID hit, I hired a young man from Lawrence Tech. His degree was in cinematography. He didn't have a job. He's a young, strong Christian who was interviewing me about creation for a final class project. He had to do a documentary. He wanted to do it on creation. And as we talked, I realized I'd been praying for about 5 years. How do I take 30 years of teaching and turn it into a class, a curriculum that people would love to watch? Instead of someone standing in front of a church with a bunch of PowerPoint slides that flash by, filmed on location in Mount St. Helens or the Grand Canyon or Bryce or Zion or Mount Rushmore or museums or the Huntsville Space Museum or the Biloxi River. There's 18 lessons. They run about 45 minutes each. I hired him full-time for 3 years, so it cost about $150,000 to produce this series. It's phenomenally well done with drone footage and all sorts of animation and all sorts of video footage. And they're just really, really fun to watch. And every one of them ends by trying to answer this question. If the evidence for creation is so strong, how can really smart people, how can professors and teachers, how can the people writing the textbooks, the museums, the scientists, how can they be so wrong? If the evidence is really true, how can they miss it? Because if we can't answer that question, it's really tough to convince young people that we're credible. So I kind of end the last 5 or 10 minutes with helping folks understand what's going on around us and why people are so blind to the truth, increasingly so. And we saw it in spades during this whole COVID election cycle that went by. There's an agenda, and it matches the agenda, it gets seen, and if it doesn't, it gets suppressed. So the items on my table are 10 items for $70. There's nine videos that have 18 lessons total. So you can get all 9 videos plus 1 book for $70. Watch them with your grandkids. Watch them and enjoy them. And then take them to your church and say, this would make a great Sunday school class in your church. Because they're set up in a 45-minute format and they have breaks for questions and answers and they come with a leader's guide. So it's just a phenomenal investment to make a difference. Okay, enough of the advertising. God's creation. Now, it is colorful, it is creative, it is unbelievably complex. And lots of times, I've seen lots and lots of great stuff by Joe Martin and others about the big things, the bombardier beetles and the woodpeckers and the giraffes and all these phenomenal animals with their abilities. I wanted to just kind of collect some lesser known, really cool stuff. But why? This is the question I get whenever I speak, and it's just heartbreaking. I get parents, I get grandparents, I get great-grandparents coming up and saying, my children, my grandchildren, they don't have any interest in Christianity. They've just, there's no faith, or they're very anti-faith. And as an engineer, I'm always working on figuring out why. Why are things the way they are? Why is that true? And this is, to my mind, the biggie. I don't think, can lose or walk away from your faith unless you have lost the awe of what God has done. I mean, a little 2-year-old and 3-year-old, we have 6 grandchildren. They're just in awe of creation. And they know there's someone behind it. They don't have to be convinced. They just inherently know it didn't make itself. Whether it's a butterfly or a flower or a blade of grass or clouds in the sky or a sunset, they're just in awe. But we lose it. Life just beats on us. We live in a fallen world, from finances to relationships, from diseases to work pressures, from marriage pressures to living life pressures. It just eats away at it. So how do you get it back? Where does it come from? Well, normally when I come, and this has probably been pretty close to the topic of my last 4 times, I will talk about where did everything come from? Creation, the facts of creation, the complexity of life, the genetics of it all. Well, the answer is it's here because it was created. And I take time to explain how evolution has all these problems that are just ignored and could not possibly be true. Or I'll talk about who made everything, because the world is trained that just small changes over time modify things, and it's these evolutionary processes that made everything. But there's no way. There had to have been intelligence behind it all, and there's lots of science to back that up. The common thing is called God. The Bible is crystal clear that Jesus himself is creator. Multiple times it says that throughout the New Testament. And Jesus claimed to be God over and over again in various ways. When was everything made? If you just read the Bible like you would read any other book and assume it actually means what it actually says, the words mean what they say, you would come to the conclusion that it was about 6,000 years ago, which is considered absurdity in the world today. But again, there's lots of science to back that up, and I'm going to end with an example of it. And lastly, how was everything made? Well, we weren't there to see it. It had to have been revealed to us. It was revealed, I think, to Adam, who passed it down son to son to son to son, ended up in the hands of Noah. He wasn't a stupid man. I think he was brilliant. If you look at the earliest civilization, and one of my lectures is on the brilliance of ancient civilizations, which is Egypt, nobody to this day can truly explain how the Great Pyramid was made. It is so perfect, so aligned, so complex, and took so much effort over such a short period of time. Brilliant people produced that structure. That was knowledge that came through Noah. Well, we're told it was supernatural. It was not a natural process that made things, made life, made the energy, made matter, made the universe. Supernatural things. When it's left out, we misinterpret biology, we misinterpret geology, we misinterpret the age of things, because we've left out what God has told us. Now, that being said, I'm not going to start with a bunch of deep, cool examples of what God has made yet. I want to set the stage, and I'm going to take you to the past with a parable. Okay, we're going to take you to the Sistine Chapel. Now, I want you to imagine with me. Imagine you're young again. And it takes a lot of imagination. But you are the child of Michelangelo, okay? You're a 6, 7, 8-year-old child. And the Pope has told your dad he has to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with beautiful biblical scenes. Now, what your dad really wants to do is sculpture. He was forced to do that to keep from being excommunicated. So he didn't even want to paint this ceiling. But he put his heart and his soul into it, and every day, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, for 3 years, he's laying on his back, drawing and then mixing color with plaster in order to create this gorgeous work of art covering an entire enormous chapel. Dad, play ball with me. I can't. I gotta paint this ceiling. Dad, coming home for supper tonight? I can't. I gotta paint the ceiling. Gotta get it done. Year after year. And you're kind of resentful. Well, he finally gets it done, goes on to other things, dies, years go by, decades pass, and you're getting older, and you decide, I really should go see this chapel. Even though I resented it growing up, I gotta go see it. So you go to the Vatican and you join a tour group and you're walking through the chapel, and the tour group leader, he says, this room is a miracle. You see, the ceiling was just plain, and then the roof started to leak, and water started to leach down through the stone, and it picked up minerals, and images started to appear, and colors started to harden. And over a period of years, all of these beautiful works of art just appeared by random processes as the minerals came through and formed this picture. What would you feel? No, seriously, what would you feel if you were told that? How did that happen? Well, how did that happen? Remember, you were his child. You knew exactly how it happened. What would you feel?
I feel like, wait a minute.
Disbelief? Anybody think they'd be mad? Anger? Disgust? Irritation? I would hope so. You understand that's exactly what's going on around us. We know where things came from. We've been told where they came from, and we're told just random processes made them by the experts, by the tour guides of the world today. And we are given the responsibility of sharing the truth with the world. Now, what I'm talking about tonight is why does the subject of creation matter? Not how, when, where, who, but why. Why does it matter so much? And I'm not necessarily going to start right away with Genesis, the greatest book on creation with the most details. I'm going to go to the second greatest book on creation in the Bible to answer this question, why does it matter? And I'm going to come back to it at the very end again. But I'm going to go to the book of Job. Now, Job is considered to be the oldest record, the oldest book of the Bible, not in what it describes, but rather when it was actually written, when it was compiled. Way precedes Moses, probably by 500 or more years. It's assumed by religious folks who have studied it to be up 4,000 years old, and I think that's right, because if you look at the time frames of man, how long they lived, they started out living 900 years, and right up until the time of the flood, they were living 800 and 900 years. For the first generation after the flood, they were down in the 400 or 500 years. Within a few generations, 3, 4, 5 generations, their lifetimes were down to about 200 years at the time of Abraham. Job also lived in the range of 200 years. So I think they were sort of in that same contemporary period. That's my thinking. It contains incredible scientific insights. Now, that's a whole lecture in and of itself we're not going to get into. But it just talks about stuff that could never have been known by mankind at that time period had it not been given insights by God. But here's the biggie, because this is the other reason people use to reject Christianity, reject the Bible, not really want to come and bow and accept what God has done for them. There's so much pain and suffering in the world, both personally and all around us. And lastly, this book ultimately provides the ultimate solution and the hope for that, I think, as well as almost the New Testament in its own way. So let's just jump in, give it a little review. I know we're for the most part, everybody here is Christians. You've heard it, a lot of this stuff, but let me just review. Just bear with me. Okay, so Job was this phenomenal man. Satan came as a test to try to say, I've roamed across the earth, and God points out Job as a man who was really, truly living and following for him to the best of his ability. And Satan said, yeah, that's because he's rich and wealthy and you've blessed him so much. What would happen if you didn't? God said, well, let's find out. See, Job had 7 sons and 7 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 5,000 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, large numbers of slaves and servants, and he was the greatest man among all the people of the East. He was Bill Gates of the ancient time period, okay? This guy was rich and very, very blessed. All right? So then over a very short period of time, all 10 of his children die. Natural disaster. God's in control of weather. He was allowed to die. God's fault in a way. All of his wealth was destroyed to the point he owned nothing. And then I think he was in more agony and misery than probably any other human being short of Jesus Christ on the cross. He was, every inch from the soles of his feet to the tip of his head was covered with oozing, bloody sores with an unbelievable, unstoppable pain and itching. And he's just scraping himself, laying in a dump with pottery, trying to relieve the pain he's in. And nothing works. Everything's gone. And he has no idea why. Okay? That's where we're at. In the midst of this, he does not doubt that God is still in control. He says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. He has nothing. No health, no wealth, no family. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. But he still says, may the name of the Lord be praised. Start to get a feeling for why God said what he said about Job. And in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. See, that's what we tend to do. It's like, well, why would you do that, God? That's charging God with the wrongdoing in a way, okay? Even his wife said, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Like, she's in a lot of pain too. He replied, you're talking like a foolish woman. How should we accept good and not trouble? See, he knew this is a fallen world. We're going to have trouble. And in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. And in one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture is this comment by Job. In the midst of all this pain, God's still revealing things to him. He says, by the way, he doesn't hope that he has an eternal future. He doesn't even necessarily believe. He says, I know my Redeemer lives, and that in the end, he will stand upon this earth. Isn't that phenomenal? Jesus Christ. That's God's. The Redeemer has got to be someone who is God himself standing on the earth. All right. So, the greatest test was 36 chapters of 4 friends coming and trying to convince Job that if he would just follow a set of rules, if he'd just been a better person, if he'd have just worked things out with his own actions, these things wouldn't have happened to him. You know, that's work salvation. That's the beginning of this whole idea that religion will save us. We just got to do the right things, and we can kind of, everything will work out right. See, that was the real temptation, to give up on trusting God and start trusting ourselves, either for the good things or the bad things that have happened, and putting the blame there. But Job refused to do that, yet he cried. He said, I wish I'd never been born. Why has this happened? Why are you allowing it? How can you let me be in so much pain? He was asking those questions throughout. So there's pain. Pain like we've never experienced, I suspect. Always children, always health, always wealth. What is God's response to that question? Why is this happening? The question every human asks. God never answered it. God came in a 4-chapter monologue, starts by saying, well, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off the dimensions of the universe? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across the universe? On what footings is it set? On what cornerstone? When the morning stars sang and the angels shouted for joy. And then he goes on to describe, verse after verse, chapter after chapter, the things that he had created. Do you understand what God is doing? He's saying, get your focus off yourself and get your focus on me and who I am and what I've done. That's the solution to pain. And it's not trite. It's not easy. But I'm telling you, that is the solution. And that's the solution the world needs. Get your focus off yourself and get it back on God. And what was Job's response? This just struck me, and this is why I want to start this lecture right here. Job said, and he's quoting God, you told me, God, to listen and you would speak. You told me I will question you and you can answer. That's what God told to Job. Listen and then you can question. And my ears, now Job says, my ears I had heard of you. Obviously, Job knew about God. He did everything he could to obey God and follow God and honor God. But now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes, which is always the response when we as sinful people stand facing the totally holy God throughout Scripture. It's only through Jesus Christ's righteousness that we become holy, what he's done for us. But here's my question. Through that 4-chapter monologue where God is talking about all this stuff he's made, did Job see God? No. What did he see? He saw the stuff God had created being described to him because he'd seen it and now it was being described. He saw all those things that God was mentioning. He saw the stars, he saw the heavens, he saw the animals, he saw in chapters 40 and 41, literally I think there are descriptions of dinosaur type creatures called dragons in that day. But by seeing what God had made, we get the closest picture we're going to get of who God is. And we hear the same thing in Romans. We're without excuse for believing God because of what he has made. So when the awe of God is removed, when we're in the midst of the troubles, get back to looking at what God has made and understanding it could never have made itself. It's a picture of his creativity, his love, his protection, and his care, and his beauty, and his creativity, and a little picture of his majesty. Back to creation. That's what that chapter is all about. That's why it's so valuable. It helps us regain the awe and the perspective of who we are in comparison to who God is. Now, with that background, one more nugget. This is the end. Now we reach the end. Job passed the test. He didn't rely on works, what he had done as a blame for whether good or bad had come to him. He trusted God throughout, although he kept wondering why. So God blessed Job's latter days more than his first. Anybody remember this? He got 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 ox, and 1,000 donkeys. Anybody remember the first set of numbers? What happened? Doubled it. God doubled it. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He hadn't doubled, has he? Yes, he has. Yes, he has. You see, we are all just passing through this life. Whether we live for 100 days or 100 years, compared to eternity, it's nothing. There's no difference when you look at eternity. So that, and furthermore, God is outside of time. He knows everything that's ever going to happen to us. And if it's happening, he's allowing it. And if we trust him, it's going to be for our own good in some way, shape, or form, ours or someone else's. Those 10 that he lost, their spirits and their souls are not gone. They're either going to spend eternity with him or eternity separated from him. It's a motivation to reach out to others. And here in the Old Testament is that incredible comfort. When someone we've loved has died, if they know the Lord, they're not gone. It's right there. He has double the number of children he had before. 10 of them are just no longer present physically. And he's been given 10 more. So God also doubled his children. Had he doubled them, it would be like those first 10 never existed. Or they no longer exist. See the truths of the Bible that come out, even in the tiny little details. Okay, now let me jump into this. The awe of God. I just love this lecture. And I'm going to start little and go bigger. Okay, I'm going to start with a little thing called a pterograde. Now, I was in Wisconsin in 2020, near the end of COVID. My son and my daughter-in-law lives in Madison. And we went to the world's largest corn maze. They had cut not even 5,000, probably about 1,000-foot long pterograde. That's what that little critter is over here, into this corn maze. And I thought, this is really ironic because a pterograde is the smallest known animal that has legs. It is microscopic, 0.5 millimeters long. Okay, I want you, everybody hold up their thumb and their index finger and get it as close as you can possibly get it without it touching. Okay, see that little gap? That's about 0.5 millimeter. I mean, think of that whole animal from tail to nose is about the length of that gap. And it has 8 legs, okay? And it's kind of semi-transparent, like when you put it on a microscope slide, you generally can't even see it. But this is what it actually looks like. Isn't he cute? He's just a little teddy bear. So cute. Now, this is just the coolest thing. You know, we have all these superhero movies, and there's one called the X-Men where there's this one guy called Wolverine, and he just can't die. You know, no matter what happens to him, he just doesn't die. He just regenerates. That's this guy. Eventually, I'm going to do this lecture of all these superhero abilities, and then I'm going to show you God did them all before we ever even thought of them. For instance, you can't asphyxiate this guy. You can put him in a vacuum of space, remove every almost molecule of oxygen, and he can sit there in the vacuum for weeks, and he just shuts his body down, goes dormant. You pull him back out and give him some oxygen, he comes back to life. You can't asphyxiate him. You can't irradiate him to death, for the most part. You can up the radiation level 1,000 times above where it would normally be. Like you're an X-ray technician that's standing in front of the X-ray machine day after day, week after week. You wouldn't last very long, and it doesn't even seem to faze this guy. He's just eating it up. You can't crush him. You know, in the articles I read, they said they took the pressure up to 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. That's like taking the little critter and hitting him with a hammer. Okay? His little body just goes like a balloon and then pops back again. Okay? It's like being at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, 32,000 feet below sea level, times 8 times deeper than that, and he's not being crushed. But that's not all. Here's another picture of his cousin, a little bit different, but he's got those same 8 legs and the weird looking head. Remember, this guy's just like, you can't even see him between your 2 fingers. You can't boil him to death. You take him up to even right at boiling point temperature, and it doesn't kill him. You can't dehydrate him. They found these guys left in dry tombs that they know are hundreds of years old with not a drop of water and no moisture in the air. And you find his little dead body, you drop it in water, and he comes back to life after hundreds of years. And you can't freeze him to death. They've taken him down to close to absolute zero. Matter of fact, they found some of these guys that were frozen below freezing in a glacier that they're pretty sure goes back to the Ice Age, which I biblically would put at least 3,000, probably closer to 4,000 years old. Dug him out of the ice, thawed him out, and he starts crawling around in the water after 3,000 years of being frozen. Isn't that cool? Talk about the awe of God. Now, what is someone who doesn't believe that God created this little critter going to say? Wow, look what evolution made. Now, we laugh, but they don't, because they're trained to think that way, as was I, okay? So when I say they, I'm talking about me, trained to think that way. But it doesn't work. You see, you can't just take something and throw it in boiling water, and it's going to survive unless it's got the mechanisms and the machinery and the program ahead of time to have survived. You can't take something that doesn't have all the chemicals in its body that it can shut down and restart and freeze it, and it's going to come back to life unless it's all programmed in before it happens. So there's no little slow, gradual process, a step at a time, that's going to make that happen. It's all going to be there before this very adverse condition happens, or it's going to die. Now, the sea sapphire, I'm going to get a little bit bigger now. Now you can, open the gap between your fingers to about 1/4 of an inch. This guy's about 1/4 of an inch long. Now, I really, really like this guy too, because he's also a superhero. The first guy was like Wolverine from X-Men, who you just couldn't kill the guy. This guy has another superpower. And by the way, we love this superpower because we find it in action movies, we find it in science fiction movies, we find it in dramas, We find it in superhero movies. It just keeps popping up. And I kind of like it too. It's one of my favorite superpowers. Do you know God made a creature that can go invisible? I'm about to show you. It's pretty cool. Okay, the sea sapphire. Now, here's what the guy looks like. Looks like a little jewel. It's called a sapphire because it has that sapphire blue. Turns out it's made of a series of scales like a butterfly. But when light hits something and bounces back, if it's a perfect reflector, you'll see white light. You see colors because it absorbs other colors and allows that color to bounce back, and that's what you see. Well, this critter, the light goes through the scales, hits the scales underneath, bounces back, and it absorbs everything but blue. Now, it's like if the scales are this far apart, you know, when the light goes through it, that blue, they're separated by such a distance that the wavelength of all the other colors are absorbed and blue isn't. But when this critter turns, like this, now when the light comes through it, it passes a longer distance, and when it bounces back, the blue gets absorbed. So all the colors of the spectrum become absorbed and nothing bounces back. And because its body's kind of translucent, because nothing's bouncing back, all of a sudden you can see right through the creature. And it's like it just turned invisible. Let me show you what it looks like. Here it is facing toward you. Now it's about to turn. It just disappeared. You see the ocean bottom below it when it turns. God created a creature who can go invisible. Isn't that cool? That's the awe of our Creator. Those scales just happen to be the right distance, the right length, the right size, absorb the right wavelengths. No, it's all designed. It's just an incredible little picture of God's creativity. How about, now we're going to get bigger, honeybees. Honeybees have a teeny little brain. They're about the size of a grain of sand. They have maybe 1 million neutrons. Our brains are several thousand times bigger, and they have millions of neutrons, and they're all connected to give us intelligence. So researchers at Princeton University decided, let's just see how intelligent bees are and whether they can learn a pattern and figure things out. Well, what they did, they took all the bees and they kind of put them in a hive, and then they put a source of food 150 feet away. By the way, all of these are just single pages out of these devotionals, the kind of pages that are really neat that I like to talk about. Then they let the bees out, and they timed how long will it take a single bee to find that food, go back to the hive, tell the other bees where it's at, and a whole bunch of bees from that hive show up in order to start gathering this really rich sugar source. And it took about 10 minutes. A bee found it really quick, flew back, and by the way, when the bee flies back, it goes into the hive and it does this little dance, okay? It kind of wiggles its butt and then walks through the honeycombs, okay? And the other bees are watching it. And it took researchers a long time, clear back into the 60s, they figured out that that dance isn't random. It lines itself up with a perfectly up and down reference line of the honeycombs, and the angle at which it dances is the angle they have to fly in order to find the food source. And the number of times it goes around will tell them how far away it is. So that bee is telling them how far to fly and what direction to fly. Now think about this for a second. Suppose some bee flies out and finds this really great big flower with lots of nectar, and it flies back to the hive for the first time ever, and it starts wiggling its butt. Do you think the other bees are going to know what to do? I think they're going to say, well, George looks like he's having an epileptic fit. They're not going to know what it means. They're going to be clueless. It's going to mean nothing. It's going to be a waste of effort and energy. You see, unless they're programmed to understand these things, it's worthless and pointless and useless. See, all of this points to God, a creator who allows an insect to communicate complex trajectory. So the researchers moved the source of food another 150 feet. It's 300 feet away. And interestingly, it still only took 10 minutes for the first bee to find it. And but they used it, by the way, they just used a different set of hives. Actually, no, it was the same set of hives. Moved it 300 feet away, and they went and they found it and came back, 10 minutes. They moved it 450 foot away. Still took about 10 minutes for the bees to show up. Now they moved the food source 600 feet away, except when they got there with the food, the bees were already there waiting for them to show up with the food. These bees had calculated the direction, how far it was going to be moved, seen the pattern, and they didn't wait for the food to be moved. They just went in advance and were all waiting and buzzing around, waiting for them to show up. Isn't that cool? The bees, with their grain of sand brain, outsmarted the Harvard researchers. Just cool. The awe of God. All right. This is kind of a quickie, but it's just cool. Notice I'm getting a little bigger each time when I go to my animals. The katydid, turns out, has like almost no bacteria on its wings. Now, bacteria is everywhere, and you can't stop it from multiplying. And by the way, probably in excess of 95% of all different varieties and grades and kinds of bacteria are not harmful. They're pretty innocuous, and many of them are very, very beneficial. Only a very few percent are harmful or deadly. I'm told we have more bacteria on and in our bodies than we have cells in our bodies. In a way, we're more bacteria than we are human. So when they found these katydids, and there's almost no bacteria, like 1,000 times less bacteria on their wings than they should be, they thought, wow, what's going on? They must have some antibacterial coating, and that could be really important. And then they started looking around, they found the same thing with dragonfly wings. There's not near the bacteria on their wings that they expected. But what they did find stunned them. It had nothing to do with chemistry. It had everything to do with design. You see, on the wings of these two animals, there are a bunch of little nano bumps, like little pillars. Let me get my pointer here. Okay, you got little pillars that come to a point. And when a bacteria, which is great big compared to all these little nails, lands on it, the weight starts to sag down until its outer membrane is punctured, and then the bacteria just dies. It's a physical antibacterial surface. Here's another look at it that came out of the technical report. You know, you've got the wing with all these little spikes, like a bed of nails. The bacteria lands and it sinks down and it gets punctured and it deflates and then it dies. They're actually working. I haven't heard that they've achieved it yet because this is hard to do on this microscopic scale. They're trying to make surfaces with all these little nano things. So you could have doorknobs and bed rails and light switches and paint in a hospital, which you wouldn't even have to sterilize. It would just kill the bacteria all by itself. Isn't that cool? So cool. Such awesome stuff God has made. Now, here's the next resource. For last year, one of the other things I did during COVID, my designer that does all my book design, she said, you've got to take some of these little fun, interesting things and turn them into 2 to 3 minute videos, because young people don't read books. You gotta make some videos. So I flew her in from Springfield, that's where she lives, and we spent the whole weekend and we filmed like 45 of these little short videos. And we called them the Without a Doubt videos. Now to find them, you just, in front of all my books, in front of my newsletter, you'll see my website, search for thetruth.net. There's no spaces, search for thetruth.net. The very first thing you'll see pop us up will be the Without a Doubt videos, watch now. You click on it and you can go to where there's a list. There's now been 35 of them finished. I want to show you what they look like, because these are great tools if you work with youth, if you have grandchildren, if you know people that just like things about nature. You're connecting God back to fun, interesting things about reality and stuff He's made. You're restoring the awe of who God made in a really simple, easy to do way. So I just want to show you one of them so you get a feel for just, these are fun to watch. So I'm not going to talk about the slug slime. You're going to watch a little video that I produced that talks about it. God told us to take dominion over creation in the book of Genesis. That means to study, understand, and control it. Now, why? Because we can learn so much from it. I mean, we can even learn from a slug. A slug, you say? Yeah, it turns out that there's a certain kind of slug that lives in Northern Europe that slugs, when they move, they leave a slime trail. It's just kind of a sticky, gooey, watery thing. You can actually see their trail as they're crawling along. Well, scientists started to study this slug from Europe, and they realized their slime is very, very elastic, which means you can stretch it and it'll snap back, and very, very sticky. Now, for years, scientists have used things like super glue to bind up wounds, and they thought, it's a little toxic and it turns a little brittle. What we need is a really flexible glue that will stay sticky. And they discovered this slug slime and thought, these has the perfect characteristics for glue. Now, don't get too excited about, having some slug slime slapped onto your cut, because it takes a lot of slugs to form enough slime to fit the market. And, slug slime farms aren't exactly practical, because the slugs only exude this kind of slime when they're scared, because they don't want birds. Like if a bird's flying overhead, out comes the sticky slug slime glue. And if the bird comes and tries to pull the slug off the sidewalk, it's stuck to the sidewalk. So the only way to get the sticky glue is to scare the slugs. And slug slime farms aren't exactly practical. I mean, you set up a movie theater, you put all your slugs on the seats, and you show them movies of scary birds, and then you scrape the slug slime sticky glue off the seats. I mean, not exactly practical. So what do? They figured out how to synthesize it. And we now have the formula for sticky slug slime glue that is currently being used to seal up wounds. Isn't that cool? Because we figured out what God did first. So we can learn from creation, develop products that benefit us in a multitude of ways, even slug slime glue. What a slugger of an idea. So that just, I showed that to just give you a feel for, these are interesting. And you can see the quality. By the way, I didn't script any of these. That's why you see me kind of hesitating a little bit. I almost think it's more effective than trying to read a script. You're just trying to explain it like you'd explain it to a friend. Okay, since the 1860s, when Darwin proposed evolution, everything that has beauty is explained, it's there because it has some function to allow the female to find the male or whatever. And the same thing with peacocks. By the way, this is what Charles Darwin said. He said, the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick, because he had no explanation. Well, the next generation of evolutionists just said, evolution explains it because it has a function. It attracts a girl. Well, about 150 years later, and by the way, here's this beautiful peacock, researchers thought, let's just test this. So they took a peacock and they cut off all those pretty colors. So this peacock was pug ugly. This was one ugly dude, okay? He had no pretty feathers. Then they sent him out in a field with dozens of beautiful peacocks and dozens of female peacocks and this pug ugly guy, and it made no difference whatsoever. The beauty had nothing to do with reproduction. It's all storytelling. Flowers are beautiful, so the insects are attracted to them. The insects are colorblind. It's all storytelling, and it can't even be true. But the students just soak it up. See, beauty is there because it reflects the nature of our Creator. You start to get that awe of someone who creates such beauty for our pleasure. The sea iguana, again, you notice the creatures are getting bigger, but this guy's just amazing, stunningly amazing. See, here he is swimming on the coral reef. Because to get his food where he lives, he's got to go into the ocean. But he's about this long, and this island where he lives is just surrounded by sharks. And eating one of these guys is like the fattest, juiciest hot dog you can imagine. I mean, we're talking slow-moving, crunchy, yummy food. So he swims out there, and fortunately, sharks have lousy eyesight, okay? So they might even have a little trouble seeing him, but they have phenomenal hearing. And this guy has this big heart. It goes boom, 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 boom. Doesn't sound like anything else on the coral reef. So the shark just tunes right in on that heartbeat, grabs a nice tasty snack. And George is sitting there with his brother Frank, and Frank goes out and it's like whomp, he's gone. So what's George gonna do? It's like he's gotta eat, but his brother just got eaten. How's he gonna get some fish to eat? You know what he does? He turns off his heart, shuts it down, stops it from beating. Then he climbs into the water and he swims around for up to 20 minutes with no heartbeat. Gets his supper? Good question. It's the only animal in existence, the only reptile or mammal we know of that at will can shut off its heart. Not just for an instant, like a missed beat, but for up to 20 minutes. Climbs back up onto shore, hasn't evolved the ability to restart its heart. Dead iguana. No, it just turns it back on. See, evolution can't possibly even begin to explain something like this. There has to be hundreds, probably thousands of programming changes to his body to allow it to run without oxygen supply, to allow it to turn off the heart at will, to allow it to turn the heart back on, to allow the right chemistry, the right balance, the right things going on with its lungs. Thousands of programming changes to the DNA structure. Probably hundreds of different chemicals in this animal that's in any other animal to allow it to all work properly and all the cells to function properly. And there's no way one step at a time that could happen. Because if any of the things are missing, and this heart either stops too soon, or doesn't stop long enough, or doesn't restart, you've got a dead animal, end of the evolutionary line. See, these things are there so we know God exists. It's why God says every human being is without excuse for belief in Him. Students aren't, they just said, oh, evolution explains it. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. My favorite bird, the bar-tailed godwit, because it's not called the bar-tailed evolution wit, amongst other reasons. Ah, this bird is so cool. You see, in the summer, it lives in Alaska because there's a smorgasbord of food blooming up in Alaska in the summer. You get the whales and the plankton and the shrimp and all those sea creatures, and they all head for Alaska. There's just bazillions of things to eat up there. But then it starts getting cold, and that poor bird's got to go where there's something to eat. So it spends its summer, it is literally, truly a snowbird, goes south to New Zealand. But here's the problem. That bird can't swim. It's not a duck or a seagull. It's got these long spindly legs, and literally if it lands, it can't take back off out of the ocean water. It's not built to do that. So it has to fly nonstop for 7,000 miles. Now this journey takes between 5 and 7 days depending on the prevailing wind. Well, scientists do what they do. They figured out how much that bird weighs, how much energy it takes each time it flaps its wings, how many times it has to flap its wings to fly that far, and they discovered it's absolutely scientifically impossible for that bird to fly that far. It's gonna nosedive into the ocean. Can't happen. So they started studying it because it does happen. Well, it turns out the bird gorges itself for weeks before taking off on its migration. And its weight increases 55%. It's like if you weigh 250 pounds, you now weigh 400 pounds. Guess what? The bird now looks like the Goodyear blimp. So it still can't fly that far, even though it's got a lot more fat to draw on, because now it's really a lousy aerodynamic shape. And it takes more energy to get there. So it still doesn't work, and they're scratching their head and they're thinking, man, what is going on? Well, it takes that fat and it eliminates the water. It turns it into this real concentrated kind of like lard, kind of real thick, hard stuff. But it's still too big, okay? It still doesn't work. So it shrivels up its internal organs, its liver, its kidneys, its stomach, its intestines. Everything in its chest just shrivels up paper thin. So now that fat can refill that cavity. It maintains its very streamlined shape. it uses that space to be filled with fuel, and now it can fly that whole distance nonstop. Isn't that cool? Talk about the awe of God. Look what he designed. A bird that can fly halfway across the globe. But think of the changes needed. How did it learn to get rid of the water and dehydrate the fat? How did it learn to change it into a completely different form? How did it learn to shrivel up its internal organs? How does it know to find that little pinpoint? By the way, there's other birds that fly and land on Fiji, which is like a little pencil dot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and they fly to the exact same island every year. How does it know how to navigate? It's got little iron particles in its beak that align with the magnetic field of the Earth. All of it designed. The opu fish, next to last example. Okay, this fish lives in the ocean. He's only about that long. He looks like someone punched it in the eye. Not very pretty, but he's really, really unique, and he has a superpower too, okay? This fish lives in salt water, but it has to lay its eggs in fresh water. It lives off the big island of Hawaii, in the state of Hawaii. It's the only place we find this particular, it's a type of fish called a goby fish, but it's a very particular kind. And this particular fish only lives there on the whole earth. Well, the only place there is fresh water near where this fish lives is at the top of a 420-foot tall waterfall. If it swims in from the ocean and it lays its fish down here in this fresh water that's flowing down this waterfall, they're just going to flush out into the salt water. They're going to die, no more opu fish. So it has to lay its fish at the top of the waterfall, up there in that stream, backstream of the waterfall. That's the only way to make the next generation, or there will be no next generation. So how does that fish get up 400 feet up to the top of that waterfall? I heard a couple of answers. A lot of kids, when I show this in the schools, they say, well, it probably flies, because they've heard of flying fish. But I explained to them, they don't fly, they just stick their fins out, and they're designed, by design, to glide. But they'll never get more than a few feet off the surface of the water, and they'll glide for a few dozen feet. I heard someone say climb, he climbs, like Spider-Man. You know, he's got sticky little finger things, and he just climbs. And then everybody laughs, and they say, well, no, but there's another movie. But in that movie, this guy has little suction cups that he uses to climb the tallest building in Dubai, this 160-foot story glass tower. That's what God gave the opu fish. On its chest, it has two fused fins that are designed perfectly to form a suction cup. And it takes that suction cup and it sticks it to the stone, shoves with its fins, sticks it again, shoves with its fins, sticks it again, and it climbs using a suction cup 420 feet to the top of the waterfall, where it jumps into the water, swims upstream, and lays the eggs that then turn into little fishlings and get flushed back down into the ocean for the next generation. So you think there was a fish that was born one day by a mutational change with a suction cup on its stomach. Hey, Mom, what's this thing on my stomach? I don't know, dear. Maybe you should go slam yourself against that rock and see if you can climb up it. It's not going to know what to do with it. And why would it know it needs to go to fresh water to lay its eggs? And it's all designed, and it's there so we'll know God exists. Mushrooms, plankton from the sea, jellyfish, weird fish under the sea that have like strobe lights going across squids, fish that live 3,000 feet down in the sea with the little light bulbs up there and by the way, they have colors. Why do you have colors where there's not enough light that there would ever be colors showing? Because God put beauty everywhere. They all have a different mixture of lucifine and luciferine. Those are the two chemicals scientists figured out if they mix together that we can make these light sticks so we can sell them and have fun with our kids at night. You notice the people who made those chemicals, is there something weird about that name, luciferine? Named after Lucifer. Anybody know that there's that verse in the Bible? He's called the angel of light. The very people referred to a biblical reference when they named the chemicals that God had created to create light. I mean, and the most common one is the lightning bug. And this is where I like the end of this lecture, because this is where I started it, because we all have these issues in our life, and we all are surrounded by people who are surrounded by pain. And when we focus on that, we lose our awe and our focus on God. And I'd like to say, if God can put a light on a bug's butt, don't you think he can light your way out of your problems? And it's just, again, it's getting you back to what has he made? What is he capable of? Look at what he's done. So I'm going to come back to this Clarkia thing. I want to end by just what God has told us, the same thing. He tells us that we are the children of light. And Jesus said the same thing. He's the way, the truth, and the light. And because of that, we're children of the day. But the world are like, they're in intellectual, emotional, and moral darkness. They don't have the light, but we do. So let us who are of the day, let us be sober. Let us put on that breastplate of faith, because God, above all else, what he expects is faith. That's what he wanted from Job. Trust me. In the midst of your problems, trust me. Look at what I've done, and then you'll have that confidence to trust me. And for a helmet, that realization of salvation, that life is short. We're just passing through it. But there's an eternity waiting for us. And that's what will get us through all these problems.